Welcome to Stories of Change. Over the years, I have become fascinated by stories, not because they tell us what happened, but because they help us understand why it happened. In this series, I share stories from history, business, science, education, and sometimes unexpected places. Together, we explore the lessons hidden inside of them and what they can teach us about change, leadership, human behavior, innovation, and adaptation. The story is interesting, the pattern is useful, the lesson is where the value lives. So let's begin. Imagine standing on a dock in New Jersey in 1956. Around you are thousands of crates, barrels, sacks, and boxes. Workers are loading a cargo the same way it has been loaded for generations, piece by piece, hour by hour, ship by ship. It was slow, it was expensive, and it was accepted as simply the way things were done. Then along comes a trucking entrepreneur named Malcolm McLean with a simple question. What if we stopped loading all the cargo into the ship and simply loaded the whole box? Today that sounds obvious. Back then it sounded ridiculous. Some people could not see the point. Others worried about what it might mean for their jobs. Most saw a box. Very few saw a revolution. In 1956, a converted oil tanker called the Ideal X carried 58 containers from New Jersey to Houston. 58. That was it. No headlines declaring the future had arrived, no industry-wide celebration, just a small experiment. And I think there's a lesson in that. When we look back at history, we often imagine change arriving with a bang. The reality is that many of the biggest changes begin quietly, as an experiment, as a question, as a possibility. The container worked, but not everyone was excited. In fact, one union leader reportedly looked at the new container ship and said, "I'd like to sing that son of a bitch." It is a strong reaction, but if you think about it, it is also understandable. He was not looking at a box. He was looking at what the box might mean. Jobs, skills, livelihoods, ways of working that had existed for generations. And that is another thing that change teaches us. People do not always react to what technology is. They often react to what they believe it means. The industry did not transform overnight. In fact, this is where the story gets really interesting. Malcolm McLean was the innovator. He had the idea, but innovators rarely change industries on their own. What they need is a first follower. A few years later, companies like Matson began experimenting with containers on their own routes. Not because they wanted to be innovative, not because they wanted to follow a trend, because they had a problem to solve. The old way was expensive. The old way was slow. The old way was no longer good enough. And that is often how adoption begins. Not with excitement, with necessity. Then came the second wave. Ports started paying attention. Shipping companies started paying attention. Rail operators started paying attention. Governments started paying attention. The conversation shifted. People stopped asking, "Does this work?" and started asking, "What would need to change if this became the future?" That question changed everything. Ports had to be redesigned. Ships had to be redesigned. Cranes had to be redesigned. Warehouses had to be redesigned. Processes changed. Jobs changed. Entire supply chains changed. The box was the visible part. The redesign was the real story. And when I think about artificial intelligence, I think there's a powerful lesson here. Many organizations today are focused on the tool. They are evaluating the model, testing the chatbot, comparing features, which is understandable. But there's little like standing on the dock in 1956 and focusing only on the container. The bigger question is this: what would need to change if we took this seriously? Because the organizations pulling ahead are not simply experimenting with AI. They are redesigning workflows, redesigning decision-making, redesigning how knowledge moves, redesigning how work gets done. And that brings me to what I call the inner game of change. For me, the inner game of change begins when we stop asking whether the technology works and start asking whether our assumptions still do. The shipping industry thought it was in the ship business. McLean realized it was the cargo movement business. That shift in thinking changed everything. Perhaps the same question applies to us. Are we focused on the tool, or are we rethinking the system around it? Because sometimes the biggest changes do not arrive looking like a revolution. Sometimes they arrive looking like a steel box, and only later do we realize they changed the world. So here's the question to leave you with. In your world, are you still evaluating the container? Or have you started redesigning the port? And remember, one of the best ways to have a sense of control over any change is by embracing it. Until next time.